I am going to hand it off to Leah and Isabella to introduce themselves. So Isabella, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Cool. Hi, I'm Isabella Bidmead. My pronouns are she, her. I got my master's in history of art from UCL in 2018, and I co-wrote my paper on Anastasia work with Marcus Mindrabo, who is a doctoral candidate in medieval history at Royal Holloway.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leah Brand. My pronouns are also she and her, and I recently, this past May, graduated from George Washington University with a master's in art history. And my paper that we'll be discussing today is on cottagecore and sort of stemmed from a lot of things that were happening culturally out of the pandemic and all sort of clashing into one another. So I'm excited to talk about it with you all.
Yeah, and before we hop into kind of our predetermined questions, if each of you could give a brief summary kind of the core themes of your paper, you know, what exactly we're going to be talking about today. So Leah, if you kind of touched on it, but if you want to go a little bit more in depth.
Sure. So cottagecore is a internet aesthetic that popped up in sort of the latter half of the 2010s and really became very popular around the start of the pandemic. And essentially, it's an aesthetic that recalls the pastoral and the rural idyll and this fantasy of escaping into the woods to a cottage and being isolated from the world. And so it's something that is about the pastoral, but also very much tied to the digital and to technology as well.
My paper was a look at open world fantasy role-playing games and themes of pastoral throughout those. I looked at Fallout 4, which is kind of outlier, Witcher 3, Breath of the Wild, and Skyrim as case studies for this, and just kind of looked at how the player interacts with the pastoral and their interaction with the world, and how they evolve and how they it's also a fantasy of escapism, not just in the killing dragons of it, but in creating their own manufactured nature inside of those video games.
Awesome. So the first question that I'd like to start with today is actually kind of a callback to our most recent symposium that we had, which is about material culture in a digital world. And so with the two of you, you're very much working in a digital sphere, but we're both still working with material culture. So for each of you, how do you define material culture when the person isn't able to physically interact with it? And Leah, I can toss it to you first to get your thoughts.
Well, one of the things that I bring up in the paper and that I think still remains very true is that the material of the technology is still something very present. And I think that as a society right now, we've gotten to a point where technology is so integrated into our everyday life and we've made it so small and so like invisible almost. We've strived to make technology invisible in our day-to-day life that we also forget sometimes that it is material, that technology is itself made up of parts. And when you're interacting even with something as ephemeral as social media, you're holding a cell phone in your hand. You know, you're physically still interacting with it, even if you're not thinking about it. And so I think that, I mean, there's definitely material culture in terms of cottagecore and what is being produced in terms of the crafting that is done and these tangible things that are still happening within cottagecore. But I think also it would be a mistake to think of the digital as completely detached from material as well. Even when you are just looking at a social media post, you're holding something in your hand, you're physically connected to it still, even if you're not actively thinking about that part.
No, I think that's a really important way to think about it. I what comes back to me all the time when I think about this personally is that sheer moment of panic when you can't find your phone, like those first few moments when you realize that suddenly this one piece is connecting you to kind of everything that we have in a lot of senses, and that sheer moment of panic when you can't find it, and how important that one object is, even though mundanely we don't think about it in that way. We think about it in terms of the ephemeral things that are on that object, not about the object itself. So I think that's a really great way to think about it.
Yeah.
Isabella, I'm going to pass it over to you too.
No, I think I would go even further on that in terms of, with digital objects. And I think the easiest way I can go about this is talk about MMOs and rare objects in MMOs, and how those are still in a way tangible objects. We interact with them sensorially, maybe not tactily, but they're visually there. Occasionally you have auditory sounds associated with it. So you're still interacting with something. There's value associated with it, depending on how many objects are set to be within certain games. So absolutely, I think you can look at digital objects as being material in very similar ways that just any other object you would find in the world to be. It's just in a different environment, and VR is kind of even blurring that sort of space even more so. Oh, sorry, MMOs, it's World of Warcraft. Does that like multiplayer online games? Sorry.
MMO is a massively multiplayer.
Right. That. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That thing.
So League of Legends, World of Warcraft, all of those, Valorant, all of those types of things. If you
Please
can't tell
me on video game terms, because I forget.
So kind of building off of that, I think that MMOs are actually kind of a good place to jump off here, because there is something that you mentioned, Isabella, when we were kind of preparing for this, and that's that farming simulators are actually a really, really big thing. And Leah, please pop in on this too, because farming simulators also kind of tie into cottagecore in a lot of ways in the aesthetic. So that video games like Stardew Valley are super popular because they replace an actual agrarian activity in a digital sphere. So if the two of you kind of want to unpack how we're replacing manual labor with a digital kind of environment, that would be great.
I mean, I'm sure Leah has seen a lot of Cottagecore posts about Stardew Valley and Animal Crossing and like just that sort of thing popping all over Pinterest and Instagram. Yeah, I think farming sims are kind of interesting space because you are specifically going for that pastoral aesthetic. You are going there because you're trying to play into that. I'm going to be a farmer who is going away from the world, specifically. But I think it's an interesting space because I was actually just listening to a podcast earlier today, and they described Stardew Valley as capitalism, the game, because you are farming and you're playing straight into, this is my farm that I am producing for profit, and I have to build and continually upgrade stuff and playing into that. So I think it's an interesting space of how you can't even escape that in the farming simulator genre.
I think it's interesting bringing up the way that you're interpreting the question, Isabella, about because to me, thinking about the farming simulators is you are trying to simulate this experience that is supposed to be tangible and is through this digital lens, where with cottagecore, what you find is a lot of that too. There's a lot of overlap with farm core and things like that as well. But there's also a real emphasis on craft. And one of the things in the paper that I bring up is this idea that you are participating in craft just by watching it unfold through these different social media posts. And a lot of the times on things like TikTok or even Instagram videos, you're watching the process of craft unfolding. And in that, you are then participating in craft via the mediator of social media. And so there's this kind of the axis of the digital is still there, but it's only mediating your tangible experience of crafting, or in that case, farming. Obviously, you set your phone down, you set your controller down, you walk away, and these things no longer are material to you the way they would be in a real farm, or if you were really throwing pottery or really weaving a basket. But you still are involved in some way in that act and in that process of making. And I think that's something that I found really interesting about Cottagecore specifically, and what it means to be involved in craft, or to be involved in that kind of process through a digital mediator.
Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant point. And it kind of moves on to something that the two of you discuss in a very, it's a theme that runs through both of your papers. This ability to be able to step away from Cottagecore, to be able to step away from the video game, has a lot to do with class, and has a lot to do with the people who are able to participate in these things. They have the ability to step away and walk away. And so in both pieces, class and class conflict, they play a huge role. And so I would like the two of you to kind of unpack how the class of the gamer or the consumer and creator contrasts with the ideal being presented, and how in a lot of cases that can be problematic. That can, create an even bigger chasm between the lifestyles that already exist.
Yeah, I'll think about an example I talked about with Fallout 4 of you create these communities that are out in the wasteland of a post-apocalyptic world, and you do need to have them set people to do farming and building of settlements, but there's not really danger associated with it. You don't have a threat of nature affecting crops. Pretty much as soon as you say someone handled food, the food is handled. And that's really not a reality with farming as we are currently seeing. That farming is heavily affected by stewardship of the environment in a proactive and mindful sense, as well as having a consistent access to it, and being able to kind of step away and say, okay, this is handled, and not really think about it, kind of in my mind encourages this idea of, farming can just be handled. As soon as you just kind of click a button, this, it's all handled in some sort of way. And I do wonder if that plays into Cottagecore at all, of, just kind of, you see this thing happening, and because it's so condensed for a TikTok video, there's not a real conception of how hard it is in a laborious sense over time.
Yeah, I definitely, that sort of issue of a warping of the realities of making is something that comes up with TikTok and Instagram and all these other social medias that Cottagecore sort of uses as a platform. Is that a TikTok video could be a minute, and you could show in that minute, start to finish, the entire process of crocheting X, Y, and Z.
Mhm.
And what you're not seeing is hours upon hours of work, and then also hours upon years upon decades for some people of training and practicing and doing this. And so there's kind of a false advertisement of ease, and that can lead to some frustrations in terms of people that don't have the time to devote to that kind of practice, being sort of barred from actually emulating those things. But Cottagecore, beyond just that, I mean, there is that element of time, right? Who has the time to actually be doing these things?
Mm-hmm.
Who has the ability to, there was a whole thing at the beginning of the pandemic. This is my biggest example of this, of when everyone was baking bread, myself included, and everybody was talking about sourdough. And the thing about something like sourdough bread is that it takes days to make just a loaf of bread, because you have to let it ferment. You have to do all of the whole, it's not just you whack it in the mixer and it's done in an hour. It takes a lot of time and a lot of skill and a lot of practice to actually get something that's edible and that you can then eat and enjoy. And so that's something that there's a lot of time literally baked into making sourdough. And that's something that is, definitely in line with wanting to return to a simpler time and make your own bread and do all these things. But who has the time to actually make their loaf of bread when it's way quicker, way more accessible to go to the store and buy a loaf of Wonder Bread or buy a loaf of whatever your favorite bread is, and then be able to be sustained by it because it's what you need to eat in order to live. And so there's that kind of false sense of time in which there are people who are, through their class, through their ability to have time for leisure, able to complete these cottagecore things. But then also at the root of cottagecore is the pastoral, which has an entire, steeped into it, a history of romanticizing peasantry, romanticizing the figure of the shepherd, this archetype of, romantic peasant. And so even though, as some scholars like Leo Marx and others have talked about in terms of the pastoral, there's also, and how it has evolved to be beyond those kinds of, sort of minstreled figures of poverty, it's still steeped into just the genre of the pastoral. And so you have those two things at play in terms of class with cottagecore, sort of the aesthetic history, but then also the real tangible reality for a lot of people wanting to engage.
Mm-hmm.
So.
I mean, and that ties into, so Erica's question about, cottagecore being a role playing in this kind of like this fantasy element. I love the Anne of Green Gables callback. I just got Gilbert Blythe in my brain, which is never a bad thing. So I kind of, Erica's question here is, it seems that cottagecore is a similar thing. It's this wanting for a pastoral, and do you kind of agree with that kind of role play aspect of it?
In terms of just, do I agree with the role playing of the pastoral?
Yeah, just in a sense of like the cottagecore seems to be the latest fad in what is exciting and fun and relaxing to kind of role play, as in like in the 90s with the late 1800s in Canada, and the 1970s with Little House on the Prairie. This is the newest in a line of fads.
I definitely think that it is the newest in a line of fads. It's part of this whole history and lexicon of the pastoral. And what makes it different and what makes it distinct from those past iterations, from Little House on the Prairie, is that it is so intrinsically tied to the digital world, because it's facilitated and curated through social media. That is the largest place in which you see these kinds of discussions happening. And one of the things I talk about in the paper is that there's a sense of this kind of cyclical nature to how cottagecore comes about, the chicken and the egg, because you have, is cottagecore something that came about and then people started posting about it? Or is it something where people's constant curation and constant posting of different media, associating it with the hashtag of cottagecore, is what has created cottagecore? And so that's part of the thing, is that it's definitely coming from a history, and it's definitely following a lot of the same sort of impulses that drew people to Anne of Green Gables and things like that in the past, drew Marie Antoinette to wanting to have her whole, Hamlet by Versailles. And so there's always been this impulse, but now we have this digital platform that has really altered the way in which it's talked about, and the way I think in which the kinds of media and the kinds of productions are happening.
Yeah, and Erica made a great comment on what you were just saying there, which is that it's less of a fad because of social media. It's more of a community, right? And we think about these digital communities, and that was actually a question that you and I had talked about discussing is what does that community look like? And kind of going on to Lisa's question, what's that community look like, and what is the correlation of gender, race, sexuality within cottagecore, and what does that look like? And also, within video games as well, what is the identity of those people that do that, and how does it create a community, and what does that community look like?
I mean, I think with the games I picked, they are the top games they are bestsellers. They are predominantly at the top of the charts across the years, and are actually more masculine, I would argue. Witcher 3 is extremely masculine. There's not a lot to say about that. Skyrim, I think, it is open to all genders, certainly, but there's heavy masculine elements, and it was heavily marketed toward the masculine audience.
Mm-hmm.
I think same with Fallout, I would say, these are definitely targeted towards masculine audiences, not that they're not open to feminine audiences, but marketed towards masculine for sure. So the fact that there's still this element of pastoralism and romanticism pastoral, I think is really interesting, that it's kind of going across gender relations for that reason, versus I feel like sometimes cottagecore tends to take on more feminine aesthetics.
Not just feminine aesthetics, but I would say that it is a very gendered in its totality cottagecore, and there's obviously talking about like queer theory and gender theory and things in terms of the kinds of ways people are expressing themselves now. It's not just that this is a women only club, and what even that means, but that this is something that is very tied historically as well to the feminine and to feminization, not just in the aesthetics of it, but in its relationship to craft. Historically in art history, we talk about craft and the arts and crafts movement, not just of the 19th century with William Morris, but of the 1970s with the second wave of feminism and the movement of arts and crafts in terms of applying those traditionally feminine practices of like weaving, of homemaking, things like baking bread, and reconsidering them. And so there is a very definite connection to that kind of feminine action, not just the aesthetics of it, because yes, there are the frilly dresses, there are flowers and these kinds of motifs, but unlike, and I have to say, Isabella, the only video game that I was familiar with beforehand was The Witcher, so I'll use that one as my point of contact. But with The Witcher, you have the action itself is more brutal and is quite literally brutal, and there is the actions of the wanderer and the masculine wanderer, and the adventurer. And cottagecore is about the home. The cottage is literally a home. It's secluded, and it's a very specific type of home, but we're dealing with something very, very much tied to the history of feminine roles. And the ways that those are then being sort of turned over or played around within cottagecore is something also that's interesting, because it's not just what people also have called on the internet trad femme, which is traditional feminine, which is a very conservative sort of presentation of like emulating the 1950s housewife, which itself can be sort of flipped over and critiqued and commented on. But this is like a different type of femininity that's being played around with.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a way to look at, Skyrim as a game where you can technically do pretty much whatever you want as long as you're going out killing things sometimes. And there's definitely a way to look at it of like with the building of your own manor house and then managing your own manor house, is that a feminine reclamation of this game that is so hyper masculine? But yeah, no, I don't think the gamer bros would be very fan of that angle.
Leah, you mentioned this in your piece that you know, cottagecore can feel exclusionary at times. So there are pockets within the community, and that's just something I'd like us to kind of touch on about those kind of, I don't want to say secularized pockets, but the kind of respun, reimagined reclaiming of certain aspects of cottagecore.
Right. I think so. Cottagecore is a hashtag as much as it is anything else.
Right.
And like I was saying before, there is a lot of what creates the definition of cottagecore is the sort of self-categorization and the cataloging that people do through social media. And what people have also done is modified cottagecore to reflect a very specific subset of their identity. So for example, there's Black cottagecore, there's cottagecore lesbians, there's queer cottagecore, there's all these different factions that integrate and intersect race, gender, and sexuality into the conversation and allow for those things to kind of splinter off into their own little bookshelf on a whole catalog is kind of how I think of it. It's a further categorization, but through that, if you think about what is the purpose of a hashtag, it's not just getting more views on your post. It's a kind of way to allow people to search and to do their own sort of, almost as if they're doing, as you do research in a database. Social media is a big database. And so hashtags allow you to move through that database in a way that curates the experience for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Allows you to, that's the thing about social media and about the internet, is it's so expansive that you are the person that is in complete control. Well, some might argue not complete, but mostly complete control of your own experience on it because you're the one curating it. And so when it comes to the internet in general, you have an issue of specific types of people and specific bodies that are privileged over others. And that, of course, is like cisgender, heterosexual, white, XYZ. And because of that, cottagecore can be very, I think like everything else on the internet, can become very waterlogged with that specific type of person that doesn't necessarily reflect how everybody is or what everybody wants to see, but still want to experience the fantasy, still want to escape to the cottage.
Mm-hmm.
And so what those different hashtags allow for is a curation and a cultivation of specific communities that serve specific identities and allow people to have their own subsect and curated experience of a much larger experience.
Yeah, and just to kind of follow up with that, the question that we just got in about cottagecore, are there any significant changes or developments that you've seen since you began your research?
In terms of just representation?
I would assume with representation or just in general, do you see where the trend is moving? Is the trend moving in a specific direction? How much longer do you think cottagecore has? Like those kinds of things.
So I've already started to see it wane, definitely. It had its height at the beginning of the pandemic, no doubt. And that was when everybody was isolated. And this is an isolation fantasy. This is a fantasy about, and I feel like a lot of people felt empowered and were able to take control of the narrative of their forced isolation by throwing on the dress of cottagecore onto the experience to make it more appealing and to allow for that escape from the harsh realities of last March. And so I think that since then it had a real peak, and it's also now maybe either plateaued or began to sort of decrease because the internet, and I'm glad I was able to get this paper out when I did, because it's so quick to turn things over. We talk about things like fast fashion and all of these other things that happen so quickly that you can't really keep up with them, and hashtags and trends are one of those things that overturn. And so I think cottagecore, the root of it, the pastoral, like we were talking about, has such a long history. That's not going anywhere. Pastoralism and digital pastoralism even is here to stay, and I don't see that going anywhere anytime soon. But cottagecore itself, the term and the way people are going about it, and the types of aesthetics that are being associated with the term, might start to fizzle out soon and could be rebranded in a different way, but then makes it something else. I think, you have people talking about commune core, or people talking about different types of escape fantasies that also include the pastoral, even if it's not by the cottagecore name. So
Yeah. I think that personally, just, as a human who's on social media, I think that, we really did see it hit a peak at the top of the pandemic, and I kind of miss it a little bit. It was very calming. I'm not gonna lie. It was a calming aesthetic to have around for a while. But moving on to something that isn't calming, Isabella, Erica wants to know about what you hear within the gaming community about integrating more women warrior roles into games, and is that something that's going to be on the rise? Is that something that you think we're going to see more of?
So I'm going to shamelessly promote my co-writer's work on this. He just did an excellent piece for the International Medieval Conference this past summer about shield maidens in Skyrim and The Witcher 3. It's a wonderful piece about how there's so many different types of weaponized femininity in these games, that you can see shield maidens, but you can also see sorceresses, and how there's different types of femininity and aggression that is expressed in these games. It's an excellent piece. Marcus Minderbo, the International Medieval Conference, whatever the title of it that he wrote.
We can link to it in the supplementals that we'll send out. We'll get it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great piece on that, but I absolutely do see that, there's, in more historical games, there are tendency towards women warriors. I think it's more interesting to see games where what was traditionally the silent protagonist, and that being defaulted to male, is now having female option or customization option. So protagonists where, like in Skyrim, where you can just say whoever it is you want, and it doesn't have to be, it can be male, female, non-gendered if you take a different race of some sort of thing. And I don't mean like human race, I mean like fantasy race. And how that kind of option for representing yourself in video games is truly opening up a little bit more. So.
I kind of want to throw in this question that's in the disguise of a comment. I think that a lot of how video games, especially because they're based on this traveler narrative and they are pastoral, a lot of it comes from gender roles that are put forth in Christianity, because Christianity and pastoralism, especially with iconography, is very deeply rooted. And I want to know if, Isabella, you think that because, we've kind of gotten to the point, like Erica said, that, we're acknowledging that women have been warriors through history, if sort of that Christian influence is beginning to wane on those types of stories and in those types of depictions.
Yeah, possibly. I really question if that's truly a Christian influence, though. Of
Hmm.
I think all religions of some sort of in their most fundamentalist state, it's hard to find some that aren't restrictive on women in the most fundamental state of all religions. So I understand that it has definitely Christian aspects to it in our Western view, but I don't necessarily see. I would see anything going more secular as
Okay.
kind of opening up. Trying to think of games that were recently released. And they're still kind of like I'm thinking about like Hades, the roguelike game that is
Hmm.
Greek mythology. That's
Yeah.
still Hades is still a male protagonist. Of Zagreus is the male protagonist. He encounters a lot of different warrior people, and it's not Christian, but he's still
There's so yeah.
so. I don't think necessarily getting away from Christianity means that you get away from this male aspect.
That type of narrative. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question really.
It does. No, it totally does.
Okay.
So Sydney wants to know from the both of you, what's the correlation between age with cottagecore and pastoral video games? Because again, a lot of us, while we grew up with technology, we did not grow up with technology to the extent that our younger brothers and sisters or our children will grow up with technology, and not everyone has access to it. So what does it mean for certain generations to interact with these concepts and others to not?
I mean, I think that kind of goes back to Erica's question about role playing in with Anna Green Gables and Little House on the Prairie. Like this is just how we're role playing in my mind. It is how we're expressing that today. I'm sure if you go back decades and even possibly centuries, you'll still have children and possibly young adults enacting fantasies of escaping from whatever's their situation and having control over their own craft. And whether that's successful or not is dependent on their own access to that, access to leisure in a certain sense. I think we have more availability of leisure to role play that sort of thing as we get older in today's day and age, but I don't necessarily think that the fantasy would have not been there for historical people.
Right, but I think just because later on in her question, demographically, the people that work with cottagecore or work or participate in cottagecore or pastoral video games is typically younger. It's unless I'm completely wrong, please tell me if I'm wrong. It's typically under the age of 40, I would assume, right?
I mean, Stardew Valley, I know it's not something I talked about, but like you'll see plenty of posts on like their Reddit page about like my mom picked this game up and she's spent 500 hours on it. And I think it's not something that is age related. I think it's in fact, there's a lot of accessibility in pastoral video games because of ease of gameplay, and once you can get into it, yeah.
I think for cottagecore, it comes back to the situation of cottagecore is what people call cottagecore. And in order for something to become cottagecore, it must be deemed cottagecore by someone somewhere, and it then proliferated into the like big black hole of content that comes from social media. And so I think that, of course, there is just by nature of these specific social media platforms, the age ranges of who uses them and who uses them more frequently definitely skews younger. And I think that is part of why cottagecore maybe manifests in some of the ways that it does, is because it is part of this current, like I said, very like cyclical in with the new, out with the old way that social media really works. And but I think that, it really brings into question a lot of how cottagecore comes up in day-to-day life, because a lot of the things that people of all ages are doing, whether they know it or not, can be deemed cottagecore. And so then it becomes the power of naming it, of actually categorizing it, because maybe only people, 18 or 13 to 30, let's say, are on TikTok, really engaging with cottagecore things. But you can't tell me that only people 13 to 30 are baking bread or weaving baskets or doing all these other things in their spare time. And so the aesthetic itself can be cultivated by anyone. The question is about then who is cataloging, who is curating. And once somebody knows about cottagecore and is aware and tapped into it, then they're able to sort of see it and deem it upon anything that they choose. So it is one of those things where I think it really relies upon the naming, and in order to be privy to the naming, you have to be tapped into those circles in which you're seeing those hashtags, in which that content is appearing to you. Because for a lot of people, yes, there is this hashtag that you can then curate for yourself, but a lot of this happens without any actual direct action, and it's a very passive situation. Scrolling on TikTok, and the algorithm is what tells you what to watch, and that's how you find cottagecore. It's a lot of people don't actively seek it out either, and so I think that for that reason it does skew younger, but it also has the potential to be available to anyone with any kind of social media imprint. So
I think that's very interesting to think about, because honestly, I think that I personally think about, the things being at my fingertips, and that, my grandparents not engaging with those things, and technology that we engage with not necessarily being what our parents engage with or what our grandparents engage with, but it is actually exceptionally accessible. If anyone has any more questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We're going to be wrapping up in about 15 minutes. But there is one last question that we had that we kind of wanted to talk about. And that was this. When we're talking about solitude and solitary action in both video games and in cottagecore, there's a dichotomy between being alone and doing something, but also having a community and doing something. And I think a lot of that has to do with comfort. A lot of these things, even though, video games can be inherently violent, and cottagecore can be stressful in some ways because it's content creation, this all has to do with comfort. So if the two of you could kind of talk about the dichotomy of comfort within these two realms. And I'll start off with Isabella.
So sorry, just answering a question that Mary Kate had. Would you please repeat that?
Talking about kind of the dichotomy of comfort and action in, cottagecore and video games, and solitary versus community, like how there's basically a very big dichotomy within each of these mediums.
Right, sorry. So I think with the video games, the ones I was talking about are all single player. So you do these things in your own world, and there are NPCs, non-player characters that you interact with. You can create communities around that, but you are essentially doing this in solitude. You are forging fake relationships with these characters. So it is kind of an isolationist fantasy as well, of this is the world that I can create in a perfect sense, because there's no real obstacles of reality to inflict upon that. I think it would be really hard to kind of enact these fantasies with other player interactions, because what one person's ideal nature, manicured nature, might look like is different than yours. So you can create your own perfect sense in your own game. And it's kind of closed off as opposed to being in communication with other people's. You can share it if you wish to, but there's absolutely the option to just keep it to yourself and keep your own fantasy.
With Cottagecore, I think that this sort of solitude versus the collective is one of the biggest contradictory elements, but also one of the things that really defines it, because essentially it's a fantasy of isolation. And yet, as I was saying earlier, it is only cottagecore when it is deemed such. And so you can't actually really participate in cottagecore if there's no participation with the larger social media phenomenon. And so you have to be tapped in to the net. You have to be tapped in to the digital and to this wide array of people in this larger community. And there is only connectivity on the internet. And so it's one of those things where in order to engage in cottagecore and the escapist fantasy, you also have to then engage in a larger community, in a larger collective action and collective imagination of this fantasy. And so that's one of the things, is that not only is cottagecore sort of have the dichotomy of being about nature and also relying on the digital, but it's the isolation with connectivity, and that's something that is really unique about it as well. So it's because actually, really, if you think about it, fulfilling the cottagecore fantasy, if you were really to go live out in a cottage in the middle of the woods by yourself, you would have no way of being involved in this, larger collective of production. And so it no longer is cottagecore.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, Isabel.
Oh no, I just think that's, with what you're saying, if you were to actually go out and live in a cottage by yourself, that is kind of more what this video game simulated. It was like, you go out and you choose a place where you're going to build this manor of the games I've chosen, and you can talk to people, but you absolutely do not have to. You can be the wanderer by yourself, living in your own manor with servants that you hire and choose not to talk to. You can absolutely do that fantasy. And I think that in some ways is because you can put it down, it's more appealing. You don't have to deal with the isolation of that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, as Erica says, the internet doesn't always work in the middle of nowhere. So,
Yes.
Forced isolation. Sometimes the internet doesn't work in the middle of places. So, forced isolation. Erica also had a question. It seems that since cottagecore and pastoral games are online, they change, adapt, circulate faster than TV and movies, which take a long time to produce. What do the speakers think about how much is lost when the digital worlds made for smaller audiences get translated to the screen for larger audiences? And I actually have an example of this, Isabella, that I'd like you to touch on, which is the Witcher television show.
So
which I know you're happy to talk about.
Oh yes. First off, I'm gonna challenge that. Big box video games take longer than movies. They take years and years and years. So the fact there is no rapid thing about this, and that is a huge issue a lot of times with video games, is that sometimes you're too far down the line to make any changes, and it's like, well, this is the game. So I think things get lost because they take so long, actually, not because they take so quick. In that way, the Witcher TV series changes a whole lot because they are so adaptable, and they take breaks between everything. I think the Witcher TV series leads more into this urban aspect than the game does, because it's not as visually appealing to see characters in a forest all the time as it is to pretend to be in a forest and come across civilization every so often as in the video game. So the TV series doesn't represent a pastoral as much as it does medieval, I would say. You're in medieval town settings for the most part. And I think that's probably I've yet to see the new season, as everyone else does. I have no idea if they're going to be a little bit more in the woods in the next season. But yeah, I think they can make changes about what an audience is more willing to see easier than, this is the game. This took us 5 years, and this is the game. This is what you're going to get.
Leah, can you, off the top of my head, the only kind of like movie that aspires a cottagecore aesthetic in my brain is Midsummer, but I'm not sure that that's an appropriate example.
So it's interesting that you say that, because I would say definitely not Midsummer, but I mean, that's the aesthetic. The aesthetic
Yeah.
very much, a lot of, the florals and being out in nature, certainly. But I think what might surprise you to be the film that is most associated with cottagecore and came up the most in cottagecore was Matilda. If anyone remembers Matilda, Miss Honey's house at the end.
Oh.
Thing that, and I think that this also definitely ties into the generational aspect of it, in that I feel like a lot of the kids who grew up watching Matilda and really associated that ending scene and that ending scenario where they're picnicking, where they have this little cottage and it's like so idyllic but utopic almost, is something that I think a lot of people of that generation and the following generations who grew up with it really honed in on, and also really like stuck with, because as even though cottagecore really didn't start becoming a thing until I think like 2016 was when maybe it was first really started being used, and then it didn't really rev up into mainstream until the pandemic happened. But when that happened, you would see posts that were being tagged cottagecore that were stills from Matilda. And so I think like the imprint in that memory of that sensation and the desire to retreat to that, because in the film, that ending is a retreat. It's a reprieve from all of the things that Matilda, the character, had to go through beforehand. And this is the salvation. And this is the, she gets to be herself, alone with, outside of the societal expectations of what her family had for her. And so that's something that I think really resonated with a lot of people. And you saw echoed out still through cottagecore. And so I agree. I think in terms of the temporal sort of conditions of cottagecore, it's social media. It's these posts can take anything from, 3 to 5 minutes to 30 seconds to make, to just click send. And sometimes they take much longer. That's another thing that you don't really get to see because of the nature of social media, is you don't know how much effort or time, there's an invisible sort of labor behind just making those posts. And you don't know if it's something somebody thought up in 2 seconds and tweeted out, or if it's a video that somebody spent hours editing down and whittling until it's a minute, and it only takes you a minute to consume. And so, but you also have these echoes from all these other touchstones of culture and material culture from the past that come into it and get folded into it. And so, to have Matilda, which came out in the 90s, echoing really loudly in 2020, 2021, that says something, I think, maybe about the people that are honing into it, but also about our cultural sort of sensibility towards the pastoral. And just because we call it cottagecore now doesn't mean that it hasn't been around and it doesn't have very deep roots. And I think that even if cottagecore, and well, in my opinion, when cottagecore becomes an irrelevant sort of term, that people don't really think about, and except for like the wistful sort of nostalgia for a very specific time in the early onset of the pandemic. I think that that sensibility and that mentality that cottagecore represents will remain and will still be there.
Yeah, and Erica, I think that's an excellent comment. You know, everything is about a hero's journey, which, you know, you go into nature, you go on a quest, you save the day, and even if saving the day is making your own butter and sourdough, that saves the day. Ladies, this has been a great chat. This has been so great. Honestly, I've learned so much because I feel like I knew nothing coming into this, and I feel like I know so much more now. CMSMC does these events pretty frequently, but we just want to thank everyone for coming today. And Mary Kate is going to let you know about all of our upcoming events. She will also be sending out a resource sheet with everything that we've kind of talked about today, links to both of their articles, links to articles that they've talked about, and their contact information if you have any further questions for the two of them that you want to discuss.
Excellent. Thanks. So we have an event coming up at the end of September, September 22nd. It's going to be an intro to grant writing. Following that, in October, we have our book club where we'll be reading The Witches for a little Halloween themed book club. And then in November, we're going to be having our symposium on November 20th. We're going to be announcing that on Tuesday after Labor Day, so be on the lookout for that. But our symposium's coming your way. And then on December 8th, we're going to have an interviewing workshop as well. Thank you all so much for attending, and I'll be sure to send out the resource sheet after. And thank you so much to Isabella and Leah for a wonderful discussion.
Everybody have a great holiday weekend.
Thank you.